Ermolyeva is a prominent microbiologist and epidemiologist, one of the founders of modern Russian microbiology. At a young age, raising her life, she made a discovery that defeated cholera. During the Great Patriotic War, she invented the Soviet version of penicillin, for which she received the nickname Mrs. Penicillin. Dose. Zinaida Ermolyeva was born in 1898. In 1915, Ermolyeva graduated from high school with a gold medal and decided to become a doctor. The girl loved the music of Tchaikovsky, and she was struck by a book that described the death of the composer from cholera. Zinaida decided that she would invent a cure for this terrible disease. Fight against cholera pathogens. Ermolyeva became interested in microbiology after the second course. In 1921, she graduated from the institute and became an assistant at the Department of Microbiology. In 1922, a cholera epidemic broke out on the Don, and Ermolyeva was appointed head of the Department of the Bacteriological Institute. Exploring the ways of infection, she was able to isolate cholera-like vibриos from tap water. She began to experiment on herself. Ermolyeva drank water with microbes dissolved in it. A few hours later, she became seriously ill and almost died. Thus, the 24-year-old girl made discovery. Luminous cholera-like vibриos subsequently began to bear her name. Based on the experiments of the microbiology, sanitary standards for water chlorination were created, which are still used today. In 1925, Ermolyeva moved to Moscow. She took a small suitcase with a collection of 500 laboratory cultures of cholera pathogens. She was appointed head of the Department of the Microbiological Biochemistry of the Biochemical Institute, which became a part of the Institute of Experimental Medicine, VIEM, in 1934. By 1939, Ermolyeva was sent to Afghanistan to prevent the beginning cholera epidemic. There, she invented methods for rapid diagnosis of the disease and created a powerful drug that was effective not only in cholera, but in typhoid fever and diphtheria. For this development, Ermolyeva was awarded the title of professor. In 1942, she was sent to the busiest Stalingrad, where a cholera epidemic began in the German troops. To prevent the spread of the disease among the inhabitants of the city and the Soviet military, Ermolyeva launched the production of a bacteriophage. 50,000 people received this life-saving drug every day. She also carried out chlorination of wells and organized mass vaccinations. For this, the microbiologist received the Stalin Prize, which she donated to the construction of a fighter aircraft named after her, Zinaida Ermolyeva. Development of penicillin. Ermolyeva began to study the properties of mold. The experiments were successful, but medical officials insisted on stopping them, calling it obscurantism. During the Second World War, Western scientists set up the production of penicillin, but they didn't want to sell the technology to the USSR. Ermolyeva was recommended to continue her work with mold. The microbiologist, along with colleagues, brought mold from trees and lawns to the laboratory and grew it on food. The 93rd sample mold from the wall of the bomb shelter showed the necessary activity. After the first successful test in Moscow, Ermolyeva went to the test crustosing military hospitals. The development of penicillin. Ermolyeva began to study the properties of mold. The experiments were successful, but medical officials insisted on stopping them, calling it obscurantism. During the Second World War, Western scientists set up the production of penicillin, but they didn't want to sell the technology to the USSR. Ermolyeva was recommended to continue her work with mold. The microbiologist, along with colleagues, brought mold from trees and lawns to the laboratory and grew it on food. The 93rd sample mold from the wall of the bomb shelter showed the necessary activity. After the first successful test in Moscow, Ermolyeva went to the test crustosing military hospitals. The Soviet domestic drug crustosing saved many wounded from death and disability. In 1945-1947, Ermolyeva was a director of the Institute for Biological Prevention of Infections. In 1947, the Research Institute of Penicillin was created, in which she headed the Department of the Experimental Therapy. From 1952 until the end of her life, Ermolyeva headed the Department of Microbiology and the Laboratory of New Antibiotics at the Central Institute for Postgraduate Medical Education, now the Russian Medical Academy of Postgraduate Education. She also founded and edited the journal Antibiotics. Ermolyeva published about 500 scientific papers and 6 monographs. Under her leadership, drugs such as levomycin, streptomycin, interferon, and etc. were developed. She prepared about 180 dissertations for defense, including 34 doctoral ones. Professor Ermolyeva was recognized as an honored scientist of the RSFSR for her contribution to science. She was awarded 2 Orders of Lenin, the Order of the Red Banner of Labor, and the Order of the Badge of Honor. Zinaida Ermolyeva died on the 2nd of December 1974. She was buried in Moscow at the Kuzminsky Cemetery.